Hello, everyone, and welcome back once again. It's good for a change to be on studio, even if it's improvised like mine. But it's good to have some backup, not just driving and talking out of memory. And then when you finish the video, you suddenly realize that you forgot to say a bunch of things. This happens to me quite a lot. But today I wanna talk about the military aspect of the war. There are many contradictions in the whole in the story of the war since February 2022. Notice that the war has been it's began before in 2014, but it began to be more noticed and for sure making the headlines several hundred% more after February 2022. And I want to talk some of this about some of those headlines. For example, like the one I'm about to show you, and then compare to some newer ones, and then maybe try to answer some questions that might be in the minds of the people who follow this war and who follow the geopolitics. I mean, I know there are people who tend to be more attentive to the political aspect, to the macro aspect, and there are more people who like, for example, Dima Military Summary Channel and every day takes a peek at the front lines. I think that's a good way to understand it too, but I think if you look in the macro scene, you can find better understanding, because you can easily get lost in the minutiae, in the episodes of a killed soldier, a statement done by another soldier, some um, some unusual event that sometimes the news try that singular events, sometimes the news tell them like they represent the whole, right? This can mislead people, and that's actually how propaganda works. And I have a great example to start with. I mean, this is from March 2022, so right at the opening of the Russian offensive. And let's see if I don't screw up this here. Yeah. So you see from The Guardian, you had demoralized Russian soldiers tell of anger at being duped into war. This was the phase where a lot of news outlets in the West argued that Russia was really not a second but third, fourth rate army. And the country had no will to fight. Their soldiers had absolutely no will to fight. Remember also other news that mention like even combat rations, simple things as that food for the soldier were about to run out in a few days, and a lot of this kind of news based on, I don't know if this is even true. Of course, we have no way to confirm it, but according, for example, to this one, it says like videos of POWs used for Ukraine propaganda, but there's an authentic sense of regret among Russian servicemen. Of course, they are POWs. I mean, that happens on both sides. POWs tend to say things that favor the country that captured them, right? This is, I mean, if at this point you still believe that POWs are like the oracle of truth, think again. Of course, there might be, of course, in the middle of this, you have true stories. And the important thing is trying to read between the lines. But of course, even if they are not coerced, which I know in some cases, for example, on the Russian side where POWs were not coerced, but somehow they are afraid. I remember a famous POW on the Russian side. This English guy. What was his name? Oh, I really can't recall now. Aiden Iceland. Yeah, Aiden Iceland. You remember in the meantime, he was convicted to death sentence, but in the meantime, he was released, and he appeared again, mocking Russia like from afar. It's like when a stronger a kid beats the other in a fight, and then the other, after he gets like 100 meters afar, he starts to tease him and taunt him again because he's from a safe distance. This is what Aiden Islin did. And Aiden Islin did things like this. He was learning how to sing the Russian national anthem, and being regret of all his sins and everything. But he was just afraid. I mean, he was not coerced to do that. So, and then you have, of course, you have all sorts of cases. You have the infamous cases of the Russian POWs being shot in the kneecap. And so, yeah, I think those guys would say pretty much anything if they feared they would be about to get a shot in the kneecap. So, yeah, so you had the news like this. I mean, painting this bleak picture of the Russian army. 5 Russian soldiers sit in a big brick building. They are blindfolded. The latest prisoners to be captured inside Ukraine. Not just the content of the news, but also the repetition of this kind of news gives you the impression that a lot of Russian soldiers are being captured and surrender. So, like the Russian army, it feels like the Russian army was on the brink of collapse. The 3-minute video was filmed under conditions of duress. The soldiers are evidently scared, and yet there are numerous similar interviews with Russian captives which have been circulating on Ukrainian social media channels expressing similar sentiments. You see what I was saying? Anyway, this was March 2022. You can go back and check the Guardian articles on these dates. And then you had, for example, about, 1.5 years later, you had also titles like this: Russian troops to abandon front lines to collapsing morale, says ex-commander. So, a former senior Russian commander has claimed that some Moscow's forces are on the brink of abandoning their frontline positions in Ukraine to collapsing morale. You see, this was allegedly said by Sergei Gulayev, who served, according to this news outlet, who served as a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet army. Told the express.co.uk that he has been monitoring the situation in Ukraine and is regularly in touch with Russian officials deployed in the war-torn nation. You see, how can anyone say anything to any news outlet? And if you, at this point in the war, if you were an ex-something, Soviet, Russian, whatever, and you are hired by a Western outlet that pays you, I suppose, at least good, you will say things like this very easily, especially if you are from afar and if you are far from the conflict and from your country. And he goes on saying in this interview, the army despises Russian President Vladimir Putin, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, and Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov, Gulayev said. The army despises. These are very strong statements, right? I mean, if this would be true, this was back in August 2023. If this would be true, where would we be now? This is my question, right? I mean, you can see, even if you could not see at this time this kind of propaganda, it's easier to see now, because now we've been dosed off with huge amounts of propaganda, and now then it becomes a pattern. You see, when certain thing happens on the battlefield, you have this kind of news. When other things happen, you have other kind of news. When you have one kind of attention, going on, you had one kind of news, never direct. The truth is never expressed directly, but you kind of can understand to read between the lines, right? So just for curiosity, what he was saying, real demoralizing effect. Gulayev said soldiers were not allowed to take leave because of Russia's lack of reserves to combat Ukrainian forces. Russia's lack of reserves. I will address that with a comment later on. Some of them even had to sit in trenches for months without tank support or other vehicles to extract them, he continued. I make a short pause to say this is true, actually, for the soldiers in Ukraine, for many soldiers in Ukraine. This is not true, and I will not, of course, I will not discard exceptions to the rule. It's a 1,000-kilometer front line, so give me a break. Of course, anything can happen anywhere, but generally, generally is what shows the cohesion of the army. So if this would be generalized, of course you would have no more Russian army. This is the obvious conclusion. But some of them even had to sit in trenches for months without tank support or other vehicles to extract them, he continued. This was not even true in the times after 2014, when the Kiev was making the so-called anti-terrorist operation in the Donbass. I mean, if you read books, for example, like the book of Russell Bentley, who fought there, if you read this, it's like a memory book, a diary, based on his diary, you can see that even then, when it was not a real army, it was just a barely organized militia with basic people on the front holding the front lines, with very basic training. And even then, they had like doctors coming to the front lines, they had the inspections, they had rotations, they had a steady supply of things as cigarettes and so on, and they were reinforced in times of crisis as well. So this is, I mean, but these reports are now true for Ukraine. There are a lot of reports that indicate that Ukraine is not rotating. Morale is breaking soldiers because obviously they see sometimes their fate is inevitable, so they abandon their places. Okay. And then you have other nonsense there. There were also incidents in which the former commander was asked to purchase military jeeps because soldiers did not have access to military ambulance to evacuate the wounded. We're talking about a very miserable barefoot army, which was sometimes the case of the militia of the Donbass back in the early days of the Donbass war. From 2014, 15, 16, and so on, which gave name to the Somali battalion, if you recall. Somali was because sometimes you had soldiers in, this kind of footwear, which only a string between your fingers and your sole. I don't remember like sandals, kind of a sandals. So there comes the nickname of the Somali battalion, which was a very brave battalion and inflicted heavy defeats on the Ukrainian army, along with others, of course, not alone. Okay, and then so you have that kind of news, and you have this kind of news, and you have also this one. This one, I think this one. Let me see if I can. Okay. Ex-US general predicts Ukraine victory in 2023. Momentum is with them. I mean, not many words that I can say. I mean, for ones who follow this, General Ben Hodges is famous for saying this kind of stuff. Former US General Ben Hodges predicted Ukraine will probably defeat Russia in the coming year. Will probably defeat Russia. I mean, either he was a very lousy general, utter incompetent, I mean, a complete fool, and then who knows how he came to be a general? That's one of the hypotheses. Or he is blatantly spewing propaganda, what he is paid for, right? It can only be one of these two. But just for fun, uh, Russia, despite the vast size of its military, has struggled to achieve substantial goals in Ukraine after more than 10 months of fighting. The war exposed weaknesses among Putin's troops. Putin's troops is like Hitler's panzers, it's the same terminology, including an apparent inability to maintain motivated, well trained soldiers. This has allowed Ukraine in recent months to retake thousands of square miles of formerly occupied territory. They did retake territory, and sometimes a substantial chunk of it, like in the case of Kharkov. Uh, Not in the case of shit memory in the south. Memory will come. But in the case of Kharkov, because in this case the Russians decided to retreat to a more advantageous position, as they realized they would not be making any offensive, and to just be sitting there with the river behind your back wouldn't be good for logistics, and would be a case for inflicting them Kherson. Sorry. And they would be, so it was the intelligent thing to do. They retreated to the left bank of the river in order to have a more solid defense, as they were not planning to do any offensive in that sector. But in the Kharkov offensive, this is where the Russians had thinned the line, and I think for the same reasons, because you remember, this is still a matter of debate. Like, were the Russians on the first days of offensive trying to conquer the whole of Ukraine, or were they not? And for me, it's clear that they were not. They used force. They flexed their muscles, but they hadn't been training for the final match. They must logically they had information that if they flexed their muscles, it would be sufficient to bring the Ukrainian government to the negotiating table and settle peace. Of course, we all know the West did not allow Ukraine to do this, and then Russia found itself suddenly in a war that I generally believe it didn't want to fight. Or it wasn't prepared, at least, for it. It did gamble. It was a gamble. This is my. So it had time. It needed time to prepare. It needed time, and to prepare an army to fight a war of this scale, I believe it takes a lot of time. 1-2 years at most. And of course, the Russian army it was already one of the best and ready armies in the world, but it hadn't fought. It hadn't fought that much. I mean, since the Georgian War I think it was the last war it fought. It had aided the militias in fighting, but it did not bear the weight of the fight. And also, a lot of things changed. A lot of things changed technologically. For example, the drones caught the Russian troops unaware to this kind of warfare, and then and a lot of other aspects. If I just try to summarize it here, I go through the risk of making huge mistakes and making blatant, making the mistake of not being precise enough and leave a lot of important information behind. So I will not do it, but there are many reasons. The point is that it wasn't ready. It flexed the muscles, and then it was suddenly caught in a fight, and it had to respond. It had to be sufficiently intelligent to be calm enough to to sustain the lines, maintaining some pressure while preparations were on the way. Why do I say this? Because preparations are giving finally the fruit now. You see finally a fully operation Russian army throughout all the front line. You see a Russian army that has learned a lot in the last 2 years of the war. It has increased it has perfected its weapons technologically. It has and most of all, it has perfected its doctrine. And it's very interesting now. If you, for example, if you go to this channel, History Legends, you can see in detail, because he analyzes the war not beforehand or in real time, but only some days or weeks after some military operations have ended. So he can analyze them with better accuracy and with a more clear narrative, because then you know what happened after. When you see analysis like that, and also other YouTubers make good analysis, but you see the coordination of the Russian army in an offensive against a very fierce defense, because the Ukrainian defense is not just crumbling like you also read in some bloggers or pro-Russian bloggers. It's not just crumbling. It's crumbling in some points because it's overwhelmed. And it's overwhelmed because the Russian army can invest strongly in multiple points and make like the domino effect. After you break one point, and then you oblige the enemy to bring reserves to this point, and then they strike the point that was left weaker, and so on and so on, and then they don't even give time for the Ukrainians to dig trenches or make any solid defenses. This is going on right now in the Donbass front line. Yeah, but Ben Hodges was predicting Ukraine victory in 2023, so last year. I mean, now you tell me, in what kind of propaganda do you believe? I have talked about this in the past, both kinds of propaganda, right? We know both sides make propaganda. We have to be realistic about it. We cannot be so blindfolded not to see, even if we support one of the sides. But if I compare the Russian propaganda or the pro-Russian bloggers or whatever against the Western propaganda, I mean, but the Western propaganda sells as much more sophisticated and more efficient. I don't know why. I guess they risk more, but when the facts meet, when the facts come up, when the reality is faced, you see that it's nothing but smoke. And I will say this. I will dare to say this. Russian propaganda has much more truth and accuracy in it. It's a kind of, for me, it's kind of designed not to fool you. It's kind of designed not to lie to you utterly, but it's designed to keep the moral up while not making a fool out of you. This is how I would describe the pro-Russian bloggers. All right, then you can also accuse me of being one of these pro-Russian YouTubers, right? I do not hide my bias, but I do not go with blatant lies as well. I do not align with those. I try to see, for example, and if you go back and you read this news and you are overwhelmed by Western propaganda and you believe this, how do you feel now? Yeah, I didn't have any before any other. If I go back and see the Russian news and I go and see TASS and RT News, whatever, and RIA Novosti in the beginning of the operation, nothing disappoints me. Nothing. Do that exercise, please. It's very interesting. So we were predicting this 2023. Everything was good. I mean, Ukrainian mega counteroffensive and then we start to see this. We start to see suddenly low hopes of what I wanted to show. This one is the best one. Before that one, defiant Ukrainian MP vows to humiliate Russia and host Eurovision Song Contest in Crimea. Remember this when this was I think also Zelensky repeated this sentence. This next year we'll have the Eurovision Song Contest held in Crimea after we take it back. You see, instead of saying like, for example, like the Russians do, like the SMO will not stop until all objectives are achieved, something like this. I mean, this kind of language we would understand it way better than this kind of bragging and. Okay, low hopes, of course we know. Low hopes. We know how the counteroffensive of Ukraine went. We know that, right? Huge losses, huge humiliation, because this was supposed to be the units trained by NATO, with NATO equipment, NATO tactics, NATO everything. And we all saw the images. You have the famous Bradley Square, now you have the Abrams Square, and I mean, Western equipment continues being poured into Ukraine, and we see it. We see what it is. Some of it is on display in Moscow now. I'll try to see it. I hope it's still there when I go there. When I go back there, I really like to see Abrams tank. And even against the stories that started to, to say that I've talked about this several times, and I also I think I insisted on talking about it, that the West is stopping aid to Ukraine, all this kind of bullshit. It's never stopped the aid to Ukraine. Never. The West never did stop the aid to Ukraine. And you keep saying this excuse. You keep saying now for the most recent defeats of Ukraine, the crumbling front line in the Donbass, they keep giving this excuse. It's because the money was delayed, and you have. I mean, I show you. Let's listen to declaration last April 29th of Stoltenberg.
Allies have not delivered what they promised. The United States spent months not agreeing a package for Ukraine, and European allies have not delivered the amount of ammunition they promised. And this has had serious.
The European allies, the US has delayed the package, and the European allies have not delivered the amount of ammunition that they promised. First of all, when they promised, no one believed they would deliver it. Simply because after scraping the bottom of many barrels around the world, of many countries' arsenals, there was simply no production capacity, and everyone knew this. You cannot just now be sorry for it and say that we must do more. You knew when you promised that this was not available.
There's consequences on the battlefield. The lack of ammunition has enabled the Russians to push forward along the front line. Lack of air defense has made it possible for more Russian missiles to hit their targets. And the lack of deep strike capabilities has made it possible for the Russians to concentrate more forces. And we see the consequences of that now. That we have to be honest, and we have to realize that when we don't deliver, when we delay supplies, it's about life and death. It has real consequences. This war is not a kind of theoretical thing. It's something that's going on 24/7. And when we are not delivering as we should, then the Ukrainians are paying the price. But
Ukrainians are paying the price because you are delivering. This is my take on it. I mean, it's the whole discussion about about if the West wasn't meddling in Ukraine, there wouldn't be no war in the first place. There wouldn't be any war in the first place. If the West hadn't been meddling in Ukraine internal affairs and destroying its democracy and replacing a government by another through a coup, none of this we would be witnessing. None of this tension, none of this risk of escalation, none of this. Of course, the ones who are suffering the more are the Ukrainians, and I do not say every Ukrainian is suffering, because some are actually profiting from it. But the average worker, the average Ukrainian family, the people, they are the ones who are suffering, and many of them, I am convinced of that, against their own will. And of course, Stoltenberg. I mean, he has to give this speech. It's like it's 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 the agenda. It has to follow through. I mean, it doesn't have any other. Uh, but saying this, if we delay, they will suffer. It's not a way to fight a war, is it? I mean, Brian Burlett goes on about this in depth. It's not just sending things. You have to organize them, train, articulate. It's a huge logistics which have been slowly but surely being destroyed in Ukraine. When they complain about lack of air defense, the Russians have been focusing destroying air defenses. Actually, this was their main focus. Recently, yeah. I mean, when I say recently, in the past 1.5 years. Let me see. Yeah, and then you have finally the BBC admitting Ukraine could face defeat in 2024. So, predictions of Ukraine victory in 2023 have turned to Ukraine could face defeat in 2024. I mean, also, this is self explanatory, but just bear in mind that it still saddens me to see some Ukrainians, not many. I mean, you've seen all the Ukrainian flags have disappeared from the social media profiles, uh, but some having to be subjected to this. In what name? You can easily, I mean, back where I am, people still tell me they are defending their country. If you get invaded by Spain, wouldn't you defend your country too? In a completely idiot comparison, because it has nothing to do with it, nothing at all. There is no. The situation is completely different. But what are they fighting for? This was announced from the beginning. And people would accuse these bloggers and journalists of, oh, he's spewing Russian propaganda, Putin's talking points, Kremlin talking points. And now you have BBC admitting. Are you going to accuse now BBC of spewing Kremlin talking points? I don't think so. And you have also the admission by the Washington Post: Russian troops advance in Ukraine as Kiev runs low on air defenses. They have been running low on air defenses now for a while. And then you have, this goes on. Pardon. As Ukrainian officials plead for more Western arms and US aid package remains stalled in Congress, Russia is advancing on the battlefield in eastern Ukraine, seizing new territory and intensifying attacks to capture the town of Chasiv Yar and others in the Donetsk region. Away from the front line, Ukraine's dwindling air defense capabilities are showing vulnerabilities as more Russian missiles and drones are able to hit targets such as critical infrastructure facilities. I would like to comment on something that really changed, I think. And this is like a question that many of you might have had since the beginning, almost since the beginning of this war. This was also a question that I became aware of after interviewing Mr. Russell Bentley, because as you all know, Russell was decisively pro-Russian, pro-Donbass, but also could be a very harsh critics of the internal affairs, especially the way that sometimes the war was being conducted. And one time he rose this question, he brought this question to me, like, why are not the Russian military destroying all the bridges in the Dnieper River? Why? And this is actually an interesting question, because when I was searching for this today on the internet, I came across this Quora post. Why doesn't Russia destroy the bridges across the Dnieper River to worsen Ukraine's military logistics? Why? This is it's. I think this is a crucial question to answer, because you know that the bulk of the Ukrainian army has a river behind them, right? And when your logistics, your supplies depend on crossing a river, and a big river like the Dnieper River, you can be in serious trouble if you have all your bridges and your ways to cross the river attacked, right? I mean, that's why the Russians retreated in Kherson to the left bank of the river, because their points of crossing were being systematically attacked. They had the the Kherson Bridge. What was the name? The Kahov. They used the Kahovka Dam, and I don't recall the name of the bridge. Sorry for that. Another bridge which was constantly being attacked. So the writing was on the wall. They knew that they didn't have much time before these 2 points were obliging them to cross all the supplies to a big army, a big chunk of the army on the other side, and all the supplies through pontoons and barges would be much more inefficient and prone to losses. So they retreated. So what can happen now to the Ukrainian army? But first of all, why only now the Russians started to attack? I think one of the reasons is, and this is my opinion, please, if you have a different one, other information, post it in the comments. I'll be glad to read them. One of the reasons is that actually the Ukrainians maintained a very reasonable level of air defenses throughout some time. Although the initial attack stages of the attack back in February destroyed a lot of infrastructures, they let a lot by far survive. Also, the Ukrainians, with the supplies from the West, were able to reinforce this. I mean, they were able to modify their missiles, to do a bunch of things to their hardware. And they were actually being a danger to Russian planes and Russian helicopters. And so, and it took some time, and it's not very efficient. I guess that the MOD in Russia thought that it was not very efficient to knock out all these bridges with expensive missiles. So they went on in the first phase to slowly but surely destroying the air defenses until they are sure they don't pose any threat. And now they are attacking effectively all these bridges. This is one hypothesis, which I think it's not the only one. True, it can be true with others, like, for example, this less probable but also plausible, that throughout time the accumulation of the Ukrainian army in the east was such that now is like the perfect time, a time of where you have finally gathered the means to do offensive operations. So it's the time where they would gonna need them the most. Imagine if you just destroy the bridges, but you don't have the means, the capability ready to big offensive operations. Eventually, with time, the enemy will adapt. They will rebuild bridges. They will construct a lot of pontoons. But if you synchronize the destruction of these bridges with your offensive, then the enemy is in deep shit because it has its hand tied. It cannot, as its hands tied, it cannot answer short term. I mean, I need my reinforcements now. I cannot wait for the bridge to be built. So if they had done it if they had done it like a year before or 1.5 years before, then the Ukrainians surely would have had the time to come up with various solutions, whatever they would be. Even if it would pose a threat or problem in any way, but it wouldn't be such as it is posing now. Again, think as you will. Post your opinion on the comments. I'll be glad to read it. But this, I remember talking to Russell, and it was quite annoyed with this fact that the Russians were not destroying the bridges. But sometimes when you are too close to the front line, and I mean, Russell was right in many times. Of course, he also committed some mistakes in his analysis, but most of the times he was right because of his knowledge of the front line and being in close proximity to the troops and to the front line, and having been a soldier himself on that same front line. He was right in many things, but sometimes when you are too close, that's exactly the problem. You're not on the high command. You do not know what the high command is thinking and how they are moving all the pieces simultaneously, because you are hundreds of kilometers away from any other parts of the front line. And of course, although Russell had contacts in some parts of the front line, but still. But he was rightfully angry about that. I mean, he felt the urgency of that had to be done to slow down the Ukrainians or the Ukrainian effectiveness. So now it's being done, and now the front lines are being pierced. I'm not going to predict any outcome, but it's not looking good for Ukraine. Now the 60 billions or 58 billion euros are unblocked from Congress. They are arriving. And, I mean, all that bullshit, because the material has always been arriving, like those ATACMS that arrived before the billions, and this is just a matter of capabilities, of physical capabilities. Also, bear in mind that Ukraine has a huge resistance factor, which causes to be very deficient in. Let's put this in other words. Try my better English. The efficiency of the supplies, a lot of it is lost in all the chaos and corruption, and also you have one of the other deficiencies of Ukraine now is manpower, because if you analyze some of the latest battles, the worst could have been avoided if they had ready shock troops to counterattack. But the kind of troops that Ukraine is throwing into combat do not have the capability to counterattack. They have the capability only to hold terrain. Still, they put up a very good fight. One must admit that. They are brave soldiers. But they do not have the capability to counterattack. Shock troops. These are the most rare, the most valuable troops for ground operations from infantry standpoint, is the shock troops, the ones that are fearless and they pierce into enemies' strongholds, or they counterattack and throw the enemy back. Actually, Ukraine is running out of such troops. hundreds, thousands of reports now that Ukraine is having difficulty in recruiting. Um, Difficulty in recruiting. And you just, I mean, you just go and you have countless reports on countless Telegram channels saying that this was, for a long time, this was claimed to be the problem of the Russian armed forces. So, yeah, I think a bit of projection was there. So, this was the video I wanted to put out today. Don't forget, in the next days, I will put out some rare footage of our friend, deceased Russell Bonner Bentley. Uh, some footage casual that I filmed while we were hanging out. Some of you who loved Russell and praised him sure would like to see, and in his memory I will start releasing them. So please follow this channel, and if you think it's worth, just share. I'm not gonna ask anything. I do not monetize it unless someday I will have some objective, concrete objective to do with that money. But then I know that I have to put out a lot more work to earn it. So for now, it stays like this. I hope you like it. I'm a full-time worker, so I do what I can. Still, I hope you like it. See you on the next one. Bye bye.